If you spend any time in the Genshin community, you've probably heard this advice before. Just aim for a 1-to-2 crit ratio. For example, 60% crit rate, 120% crit damage. 70% crit rate, 140% crit damage. Players repeat it constantly. It shows up in build guides, Reddit comments, YouTube videos, Discord discussions, almost like a universal rule of the game. But here's the strange part. In a lot of real builds, breaking that ratio barely changes your damage at all. Sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes it barely matters. And sometimes, chasing the ratio is actually the wrong decision. So today I want to explore where the famous 1-to-2 crit ratio actually comes from, why it became so popular, and why the real story is much more interesting than the rule people repeat. Because once you see how the math actually works, the whole obsession with perfect ratios starts to look a little strange. The origin. Let's start with the important part. The 1-to-2 ratio isn't random advice. It actually comes from real math. In Genshin, your expected damage is roughly based on 3 things: your attack, your crit rate, and your crit damage. And when you simplify the formula, the average damage multiplier ends up depending on the product of crit rate and crit damage. That's the key idea. If you have a limited number of crit stat points to distribute between crit rate and crit damage, the highest average damage happens when the ratio between them is about 1-to-2. That's where the rule comes from. And if you're working with the same total amount of crit stats, the math checks out. For example, imagine you had 2 builds with the exact same stat budget. One build is 40% crit rate and 80% crit damage. Another build is 20% crit rate and 160% crit damage. Those 2 builds actually deal the exact same average crit multiplier. But if you move closer to the 1-to-2 ratio, the average damage increases. So the math behind the rule is real, but here's the catch. It only works if one very specific assumption is true, and this is the assumption the game almost never satisfies. The assumption. The 1-to-2 ratio only works if you can freely move crit stats around while keeping the total amount of stats the same. In other words, if you could magically trade 10% crit rate for 20% crit damage whenever you wanted. But that's not how artifacts work. In fact, the artifact system does the exact opposite. Stats aren't flexible, they're random. And once you look at real artifact builds instead of theoretical stat budgets, the ratio suddenly becomes much less important. The RNG problem. Let's say you're building a character and you end up with this ratio: 40% crit rate, 160% crit damage. Technically, that's bad according to the rule, because the ideal ratio would be something closer to 60/120. But here's the problem. To change that ratio, you would need to replace artifacts. And artifact farming is completely random. You might spend weeks farming a new circlet just to improve your damage by 3 or 4%. Meanwhile, during those same weeks, you could have rolled better substats on your other pieces and gained more damage overall. In other words, chasing the ratio is often a worse use of your resin than simply chasing more total stats. And this leads to one of the biggest misunderstandings about the 1-to-2 rule. It treats ratios as more important than raw numbers, but most of the time, raw numbers win. Raw numbers. Here's a very simple example. 40% crit rate and 80% crit damage fits the 1-to-2 ratio perfectly, but 40% crit rate and 160% crit damage completely breaks it. And yet the second build is obviously better, because the total crit value is much higher. That example is obvious, but the same principle shows up in less obvious situations too. Imagine choosing between these 2 builds: 30% crit rate and 120% crit damage, or 50% crit rate and 70% crit damage. Both of these break the 1-to-2 rule in different directions, and without calculating the full formula, it's actually hard to tell which one deals more damage. That alone tells us something important. The ratio itself doesn't determine your damage. It's just one small piece of the puzzle. Breaking the ratio. There's another reason the 1-to-2 rule falls apart in real builds. It completely ignores your other stats. All of them can change which build is actually stronger. For example, imagine a character with perfect crit stats, but extremely low attack. Their overall damage will still suffer. In fact, the original, ideal stat distribution, that people used to derive the ratio actually included attack as part of the formula. Something like 200% attack, 70% crit rate, and around 140% crit damage. But the community simplified that into just one part of the equation, the crit ratio. And once you start looking at characters with unusual scaling, things get even messier. Cryo characters using Blizzard Strayer can get huge amounts of crit rate from passives and resonance. Characters like Hu Tao scale heavily with HP instead of attack. Reaction teams may gain more damage from elemental mastery than from additional crit. In these situations, forcing the 1-to-2 ratio can actually move your stats in the wrong direction. Why it spreads? So if the ratio is so limited, why does everyone keep repeating it? Well, because it's simple. The real damage formula is messy. It depends on your attack, your crit stats, your buffs, your team, your reaction multipliers, and sometimes even enemy resistances. The 1-to-2 ratio is easy to remember. It gives players a quick guideline when comparing artifacts. And to be fair, it's not bad advice. If two builds have the same overall stat value, the one closer to the ratio will usually perform slightly better. But slightly better is the important part. We're often talking about differences of 3, 4, maybe 5%, which is tiny compared to the stat swings you get from artifact RNG. What matters? So if the ratio isn't the most important thing, what should players focus on instead? There are a few better approaches. The first is using a build optimizer. Tools like the Genshin Optimizer can calculate the exact damage of every artifact combination you own and show you which one performs best. And sometimes the result is surprising. You might see a build with a worse crit ratio outperform another build simply because it has more total stat value. If you don't want to use an optimizer, you can still do rough comparisons using the simplified damage formula. Multiply your attack by your crit stats and compare the results. It doesn't need to be perfect. Even a rough calculation usually tells you more than chasing a ratio. But there's also one final piece of advice that many experienced players eventually arrive at, and it might be the most important one. Good enough. Genshin Impact is not a game where you need mathematically perfect builds to succeed. Many players clear the hardest content with imperfect artifacts, messy ratios, and whatever stats they happen to roll. Some people choose weapons they simply like the look of. Others stop farming artifacts once their character feels strong enough. And honestly, that approach makes a lot of sense, because the artifact system was never designed to produce perfect ratios. It was designed to give you random pieces and ask you to make the best build you can from what you have, which means the real skill isn't achieving perfect numbers. It's recognizing when a build is already good enough. The takeaway. So the 1-to-2 crit ratio isn't exactly wrong, but it's not the universal rule that people sometimes treat it as. It's a guideline that only applies when two builds have the same stat budget. And real artifact builds almost never work like that. Once you factor in RNG, attack stats, energy requirements, character scaling, and team composition, the ratio becomes just one small detail among many. Sometimes it helps. Sometimes it doesn't matter. And sometimes chasing it is a complete waste of time. Which is why many veteran players eventually stop worrying about perfect ratios entirely. They focus on total stats. They test builds in real gameplay. And if a character clears Abyss comfortably, they move on. And honestly, that mindset might be the real meta. Now I'm curious about your experience. Have you ever chased the perfect 1-to-2 ratio on a character? Did it actually make a noticeable difference, or did it mostly feel like artifact pain? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed breaking down the math behind Genshin builds like this, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more deep dives into mechanics, community myths, and how the game actually works behind the scenes. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.